courtroom fell silent as David slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "She's my blood. You can't steal her from me." Across the room, Sophie's small hand clung to Nathan's sleeve, her voice trembling but clear. "But you left." In that instant, the battle between power and love cracked wide open. What would you choose, rights or responsibility? Tell me what your heart says. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Snow had been falling for hours, soft flakes layering the city in silence. Boston glowed under the winter night streetlights, turning the icy sidewalks into mirrors of gold. The streets were nearly empty, too cold for wandering. But Nathan Cole walked without direction, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his wool coat. To the world, he was the picture of success, CEO of a global firm, tailored suit, beneath his overcoat reputation of discipline and control. Yet inside the weight of years pressed heavily against him. His penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Charles River felt more like a glass box than a home. He could not face it tonight. At a deserted bus stop, he sat down on the frost-coated bench, his breath fogging in the air. The city was quiet enough that he could hear the faint hum of traffic from blocks away. He leaned back, staring at the sky as if searching for something he had long lost. That was when he noticed the figure through the curtain of falling snow. A child. She was no more than 8, wrapped in a pink coat that looked too thin for the biting cold. Her shoes were soaked, leaving dark marks on the pavement. Clutched tightly in her arms was a paper grocery bag, its edges damp, the weight of its contents threatening to tear it apart. She took hesitant steps toward the bench, trying to hoist herself up, but her small body faltered. In an instant, she collapsed to the ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Nathan was on his feet before he could think. The bag rolled from her grasp, spilling a bruised apple and a heel of bread onto the icy concrete. He knelt beside her, tugging off one glove to touch her hand. Her skin was frighteningly cold. He shook her gently, his voice rougher than he liked. "Hey, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Wide, frightened eyes met his, shimmering with more strength than her body held. "I have to take this home," she whispered, shallow breath frosting the air. "My mommy's sick." The words struck harder than the wind. Nathan swallowed against the tightness in his throat. Without another thought, he gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile bundle against his chest. Her head dropped weakly onto his shoulder, and one small hand clutched the collar of his coat, as though she feared he might let her go. Around the corner, his driver sat idling in the black town car. The headlights cut across the snow as Nathan hurried forward, calling out. The driver's eyes widened at the sight of the child, but he opened the back door without hesitation. "Mass," General Nathan ordered. "Emergency." The car pulled away, tires hissing against the slush. Nathan held the girl close, feeling her faint breaths against his scarf. For once, he didn't look at his phone or think of contracts waiting on his desk. He stared out at the blur of lights and snow, every muscle taut, aware only of the fragile life in his arms and the echo of her words. "My mommy's sick." By the time they reached the hospital, he was running through the automatic doors. The triage nurse glanced at his expensive coat, then at the pale child in his arms, and instantly waved them through. A bed appeared, nurses rushing forward. Nathan lowered the girl gently, his hands reluctant to leave her side. "What's her name?" the nurse asked. Nathan opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the girl whispered faintly, "Sophie." Her voice was barely there yet, it carried, and then her eyes fluttered shut, pulling him into a silence he had not felt in years. Nathan froze at the foot of the bed chest, heaving. He didn't know this child, didn't know her story, yet something inside him had shifted. He felt it with startling clarity. This night had just changed everything. Hours passed. Snow continued to fall outside the hospital windows, but Nathan didn't move from the chair beside Sophie's bed. His tie lay discarded on the table, his hair damp from melted snow. He refused coffee, refused to make the calls that buzzed endlessly on his phone. His entire focus was the small, steady rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin blanket. At last, her eyelashes trembled. She turned her head weakly toward him. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You stayed." Nathan leaned forward, nodding. "Yes, I stayed." Her lips curved faintly, though exhaustion clouded her eyes. "Can I go home now? My mom will be worried." The words pierced deeper than any boardroom battle ever had. Nathan studied her thin frame, cracked lips, hair still damp from snow, and felt an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. He had built walls of steel and glass to keep pain away, but here they were shattering under the weight of a child's quiet plea. The nurse returned, checking vitals. "She needs fluids, but she'll recover," she said, then added with a glance at Nathan, "She's lucky you brought her in." Nathan whispered more to himself than anyone else. "No, I'm the lucky one," and for the first time in years he meant it. The night stretched long in the hospital, but Nathan remained beside Sophie. When the nurse finally reassured him that she would recover with fluids and rest, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Still, the girl's eyes carried a weight far too heavy for her years. She asked again to go home, not because she was afraid for herself, but because she feared for her mother. Nathan tried to reason with her, but Sophie's insistence was quiet and steady. "She doesn't know where I am." "She'll be scared," she whispered. There was no bargaining in her tone, no childish plea, only a solemn truth. Against the nurse's protest, Nathan signed the discharge papers. Soon they were in the back of a cab, the city sliding past in streaks of gray and orange light. Sophie sat upright despite her exhaustion, holding the paper grocery bag on her lap as if it were something sacred. Her small fingers tapped lightly against the damp paper, a rhythm she seemed to carry with her wherever she went. The cab turned into Brooklyn, into streets lined with weary brick buildings that leaned on one another like old men at the end of the day. Sophie guided the driver confidently, as though she knew each crack in the sidewalk by heart. They stopped in front of a narrow tenement, its staircase sagging under the weight of years. She climbed, quickly pulling from her coat pocket a shoelace tied to a bent key. Nathan followed her inside. The apartment was dim, the single bulb flickering weakly. The cold air carried the scent of damp fabric and sickness. A thin mattress lay in the corner, covered by a pile of mismatched blankets. Beneath them was a woman, her face pale, her body shrunken. She looked far older than the 30-something years she might have lived. "Mommy, I'm back," Sophie said softly, setting down the grocery bag before kneeling by her side. She pulled the blanket tighter around the frail woman's shoulders. Nathan stood frozen for a moment, taking in the room, the cracked plaster, the worn linoleum, the silence that pressed down harder than the cold. His throat ached as he stepped closer. The woman stirred faintly, her lips parting, to whisper something inaudible, before slipping back into shallow breathing. He touched her wrist, felt the faint pulse, and knew this couldn't go on another night. "She needs real care," he said, his voice low but certain. Sophie shook her head with sudden ferocity. "We have nowhere else to go." Her eyes were fierce, the kind of fierce born not from strength but desperation. Nathan crouched, meeting her at eye level. "You're not going anywhere without her. I promise." Minutes later, his call summoned a private ambulance. Snowflakes clung to his shoulders as paramedics carried Elena Ruiz into the ICU. Nathan stood outside the glass doors, fists clenched, jaw rigid, as doctors moved quickly with IV's oxygen monitors. Beside him, Sophie stood on tiptoe, her palm pressed flat against the glass, her face solemn and still. "She's in good hands now," Nathan told her quietly. Sophie looked at him with doubt in her eyes. "They won't send her away," he shook his head firmly. "Not while I'm here." The hours dragged with unbearable slowness. Nathan ignored the vibration of his phone, the constant stream of messages from his office. A $1 billion deal was hanging by a thread, a merger that had taken months to orchestrate. His assistant had texted him 3 times about the board's impatience. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Sitting in the waiting area with Sophie curled up in a chair beside him, her small body wrapped in his coat, he knew with absolute clarity that none of it mattered right now. The doctor appeared, finally, his face professional but grave. "She's stable for now," he said quietly. "But it's advanced pneumonia, likely untreated for weeks, maybe longer. Malnutrition has weakened her body. We'll keep her alive tonight. The next steps will be difficult and costly." For years, Nathan had calculated risk and profit with the precision of a man who left nothing to chance. But he didn't weigh options this time. "Do whatever it takes," he said firmly. The doctor gave a small nod, almost surprised by the certainty. When Nathan turned back, he found Sophie watching him. Her eyes, though tired, were sharp, searching. "Did he say she'll be okay?" she asked. Nathan knelt so they were face to face. "They'll fight for her," he told her, his voice steady. "And so will I." Her gaze lingered on him, as if she were testing the truth in his words. Then slowly she leaned back in the chair, hugging the paper bag to her chest like a lifeline. Nathan watched her drift to sleep, her small frame disappearing beneath his coat. His phone buzzed again on the table beside him. He silenced it without looking. Deals, contracts, numbers, all the things that had once defined him seemed smaller now, almost irrelevant. For the first time in years, Nathan didn't feel the familiar emptiness gnawing at him. Instead, he felt the weight of a responsibility he hadn't chosen, but could no longer imagine turning away from. A little girl had collapsed in the snow and he had stepped forward. He hadn't known it then, but that single act had pulled him out of the shadows of his own past and placed him squarely in hers. And with every hour that passed, the line between their lives blurred just a little more. By morning, the ICU settled into its steady rhythm machines, whispering monitors ticking out hope in green lines. Elena's breathing had grown less ragged, but the doctors were clear she would need days, maybe weeks, to have a fighting chance. A hospital social worker met Nathan and Sophie in a quiet conference room and laid out the path ahead in calm, practiced tones: paperwork for temporary guardianship insurance that didn't exist, bills that would arrive in stacked envelopes. Nathan listened, signing where he needed to, asking for none of the usual cost breakdowns. He arranged a private room once Elena could be moved, he authorized a nutrition plan, and he requested a pediatric counselor for Sophie. The social worker thanked him as if he were a good Samaritan passing through. Nathan didn't feel like a visitor. He felt like someone taking a step into a life he hadn't planned and yet somehow recognized. He returned to the waiting area to find Sophie tracing circles on the fogged window with her finger. "They're helping her," he said. "We're not leaving her alone." Sophie nodded. She doesn't like waking up to strangers. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the child beneath it, the one who had stood too long outside of closed doors. The first hit came at noon, not from the hospital but from Nathan's own world. His assistant Lauren arrived in a wool coat with a leather portfolio and the look of someone carrying a small fire. "The board needs you at 2, she said, lowering her voice. "Press is sniffing around. Someone saw you here last night. There's a blog post already. Cold-hearted CEO at ICU who's the little girl." She grimaced. "It's ugly." He took the tablet she handed him. A grainy photo showed him through glass his coat around a sleeping child. The caption was all edges. He felt heat rise in his chest, not shame, not even anger, but the impulse to shield what was private. He handed the tablet back. "She's not a headline," he said. "Keep it that way as long as you can." Lauren nodded, understanding enough to stop asking questions. "If you miss the 2 o'clock, the merger could stall. Investors are jittery." "Have legal get me options," he said. "We'll stabilize the deal without me in the room." He surprised himself at how calmly the words left his mouth. For years, he had been the only center of gravity his company knew. The idea that anything could hold without him would have sounded like fantasy last week. Not this morning. Late afternoon, a new knock sounded, this time from something harder than business. A man in a worn leather jacket strode into the waiting area, jaw set, eyes scanning like a searchlight. He was taller than Nathan expected, with the careless swagger of someone who had never learned to stay. "Where's my daughter?" He barked, his voice echoing off tile and glass. "Where is she?" "Sophie." Sophie startled and looked up, then shrank in her seat, her hand seeking Nathan's sleeve before she even registered the motion. The man's gaze snapped to them. "There you are," he said with triumph, more than relief. "Let's go. You're coming with me." Nathan stepped between them without thinking. "She's not going anywhere," he said evenly. "Her mother is in ICU." The man glared. "Who are you, Nathan Cole?" The name landed. Even if the man didn't follow business news, the certainty in Nathan's voice did what names often did, drew a line. But David Ruiz didn't back down. "I'm her father," he said. "You can't keep her from me." Sophie's voice shook. "You left." David's mouth tightened. "I'm here now." A hospital security officer appeared, then a social worker. Voices got softer, procedures took over. The social worker asked for identification and history, and whether there were any court orders. There were none. David avoided the social worker's eyes when she asked about support, about visits, about the last time he had called. "It's complicated," he said. "But I want what's best for my kid, then what's best is not scaring her." Nathan kept his tone calm. "We can talk, but not here and not like this." It moved quickly after that, the way trouble does when it finds a target. Child Protective Services opened a file. The hospital complied because that was the law, and also often the safest path. Nathan's counsel joined by phone, arranging an emergency hearing for the next day. "You'll need to demonstrate continuity of care," the attorney said. "Document everything you've done. The court respects action over speeches." That night, Nathan stayed again, the hospital a second office, its fluorescent lights the only ones he wanted. He wrote affidavits, attached receipts, authorized payments, filed petitions. He watched Sophie's sleep face turn toward the window as if light could reach her through snow and glass. Around midnight, Elena stirred in the ICU, drifting up from the heavy place of illness to the thinner air where faces live. Nathan wasn't allowed inside, but he stood at the glass while a nurse leaned close so Elena could hear. "Your daughter is safe," the nurse told her. "A man named Nathan is looking after her." Elena's lips formed the smallest thank you. Nathan pressed his palm to the glass, a silent vow that felt heavier than a signature. By morning, headlines had proliferated like frost. Commentators argued over what it meant, some calling him a cynic, others a savior. A photographer tried to slip a lens past the front desk and got escorted out. Lauren texted that 2 sponsors were threatening to pull support if Nathan courted controversy. Nathan shut the phone off again. He had a different appointment. The courthouse was colder than the hospital, though the thermostat would have disagreed. Everything about family court felt stripped of gentleness. Gray walls, metal benches, voices rehearsed into neutrality. Nathan sat at the long table with his attorney, Sophie's hand tucked into his. Across from them, David slouched with a public defender who kept whispering, "Let me speak," and being ignored. The judge entered her presence, somehow both tired and exact. She listened to the social worker's summary, her eyes flicking from page to page. She asked the right questions: who had been caring for the child? What was the mother's condition? What had the father done in the past year to support his daughter? The answers drew themselves. The record had empty spaces where a father's actions should have been. David tried to fill those blanks with volume. "She's my blood," he said, spreading his hands. "You can't just hand her to a stranger with a big wallet." Nathan stood when the judge gestured. He did not mention his company or the deal or the board seats he had fought to earn. He spoke of a bus stop in winter and a little girl who refused to think of herself before her mother. He spoke simply because the truth did not need decoration. "This isn't about money," he said, voice low but carrying. "It's about who stayed when it was freezing and frightening and hard. It's about who will show up tomorrow and the day after that. Family isn't a claim. It's a promise you keep." The room went very still. The judge watched him for a long heartbeat, then shifted her gaze to Sophie. "Who do you feel safe with?" she asked. Sophie looked at Nathan, then down at their joined hands, then back up. "Him," she said. "He didn't leave." The judge didn't react so much as absorb. Temporary guardianship to Mr. Cole, she ruled, pending the mother's recovery and a full review. Supervised visitation for Mr. Ruiz. We will reconvene with medical updates. Court is adjourned. The gavel's small knock sounded like mercy. Outside, a blast of cold met them on the courthouse steps. Cameras edged forward, but the security detail kept a clean path. Nathan felt Sophie's hand tighten. He leaned down. "We're going back to your mom now." Lauren met them at the curb with a car and a look. "Sponsors are waiting for a statement," she said. "So is the board. You've got a window before the market closes." "Draft whatever's needed," Nathan said. "Make it clear this is a private matter. And Lauren, don't use the girl's name. She's not a PR asset." Her mouth turned into a line of respect. "Understood." Back at the hospital, Elena slept the machines, forming a fragile choir. Nathan and Sophie stood at the glass again, the two of them reflected beside her. In the reflection, he saw a man he didn't quite recognize, not the strategist who moved deals into place with an elegant hand, but someone simpler, someone who had chosen a side and meant to stay there. "You said we wouldn't leave," Sophie murmured as if reminding herself. "We won't," he answered. The conflicts had not ended. The merger could still falter. The father could still damage what he had not built. The world could still grind compassion into spectacle. But in the middle of those storms, a center had appeared. He rested his palm against the glass, and for the first time in a long time he believed that keeping a promise might be the strongest kind of power there is. When Elena opened her eyes fully for the first time in days, she saw Sophie's small face leaning over her, lit with relief. Nathan stood at the edge of the bed, uncertain if he had the right to step closer. Elena's lips trembled as she whispered, "You saved her." Nathan shook his head. "She saved me. I only carried her here." There was no need for long explanations. Elena understood the weight of gratitude without words. She reached for Sophie's hand, and then her gaze shifted to Nathan. What passed between them was not a formal agreement, not even a request, but something simpler, an unspoken trust that he would not leave. Days turned into a rhythm of cautious recovery. Elena remained in the hospital tethered to IVs and the steady hum of machines, while Nathan began weaving himself into the fabric of Sophie's days. He drove her to school when the weather allowed, picked her up with hot chocolate waiting in the cup holder, and sat with her in the hospital library where she worked through homework in a spiral notebook. He learned that she loved to draw houses with wide porches and windows spilling with light. When he asked why, she said softly, "Because they always look like someone's waiting inside." One Saturday, Nathan brought her to the New York Public Library. She had never seen ceilings that high, or shelves that endless. Her eyes widened at the marble lions outside, and for the first time he saw the child in her fully unburdened, running her hands across spines of books, whispering the titles as if they were spells. He sat nearby, watching her lose herself in stories, and felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Back at the hospital, Sophie insisted on bringing her drawings to her mother. One afternoon she held up a page where 3 hands, one small one frail and one steady, were joined together. "It's us," she explained, looking between them with a matter-of-fact certainty. Nathan studied the crayon lines, his throat tightening. Elena's fingers brushed the page, her voice faint but sure. "Then we'll hold on, all of us." Evenings became small rituals. Sometimes Nathan brought takeout soup and bread, the kind Elena said reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in Puerto Rico. Other times, Sophie asked him to help with simple meals they could reheat in the family lounge. He learned quickly how to follow her instructions. Not too much salt, she would scold, trying to mimic her mother's authority. And Nathan, a man used to commanding entire boardrooms, found himself laughing as he followed orders from an 8-year-old chef. Music filled the spaces that silence used to haunt. Elena, when strong enough, would hum old boleros under her breath, and Sophie would lean against her side eyes half closed in contentment. Nathan didn't know the words, but he recognized the way they soothed, the way they built a bridge between past and present. Outside of the hospital walls, the world kept spinning with its demands. The press speculated about his motives. Was this a rebrand? A publicity stunt? Colleagues whispered that Nathan was distracted, softer, not the relentless strategist they knew. But Nathan no longer measured his worth by quarterly reports. He began to see power differently, not as control, but as the ability to make space for others to breathe. The change grew into something larger when he quietly established a foundation. Inspired by Sophie's story, he created a program to support children whose parents faced critical illness. He named it the Lantern Project, explaining to the board that lanterns were small, but in the darkest nights they made all the difference. The first funds provided housing near hospitals for families who had nowhere to go. Nathan didn't announce it with fanfare. He simply wanted children like Sophie to have one less weight to carry. As weeks passed, the sharp edges of fear softened into moments of unexpected warmth. Sophie began leaving her backpack in the corner of the Nathan's office, a sign that she felt it was hers too. Elena, though still weak, spoke of the future again, about walking outside in spring, about Sophie's next birthday, about the possibility of rebuilding without shame. Nathan found himself thinking less of what he had built in glass towers, and more of what was growing here in this fragile, ordinary space. It was not wealth that mattered, but belonging. And belonging, he realized, was built in the smallest acts, waiting by a bedside, turning the pages of a library book, standing at a stove with too much salt, and still eating the meal with gratitude. He had stepped into Sophie's life because she had collapsed in the snow. But what held him there was not obligation. It was choice. And in that choice, a new kind of family was taking shape, one crayon line, one borrowed song, one shared meal at a time. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. The merger Nathan had spent months negotiating was at its final stage. Billions hung on his signature, the kind of deal that would define the company for decades. His board insisted he attend the closing in person. His phone buzzed relentlessly with reminders, but he kept it face down on the table beside Sophie's crayons. She sat in the hospital family lounge, sketching another house with wide windows and smoke curling from the chimney. Her concentration was complete, as though the outside world did not exist. That morning, the court hearing was scheduled to determine temporary custody. Elena had grown stronger, but was still fragile, unable to leave her bed for long. David Ruiz had filed for full custody armed with claims of paternal rights. Nathan's attorney had warned him that without showing up in court, the judge could lean toward biology over presence. 2 rooms, 2 decisions, 2 futures, one in the world of power, one in the world of promise. He stood at the hospital window staring at the snow that refused to stop falling. He thought of his younger self hungry for success, believing control could protect him from the chaos of loss. And yet the greatest choice of his life was now between a deal inked in boardrooms and a promise whispered to a child at a bus stop. He walked back to Sophie and placed a hand on her drawing. "I have to go for a little while," he said gently, "but I'll be back." Her eyes lifted wide and steady. "To court, yes," he said. "Then I'll wait." She answered, simply returning to her sketch. Her faith in him carried more weight than any contract. At the courthouse, the air was sharp with anticipation. David's lawyer spoke of rights of bloodlines, of obligations ignored, but still legally binding. David sat forward, chin raised, as though reclaiming what he had abandoned. Nathan listened, his expression composed, but his hands tightened on the edge of the table. When it was his turn, he rose slowly. The courtroom hushed. He didn't begin with numbers or accomplishments. Instead, he spoke of the night he found Sophie in the snow, of carrying her into warmth, of waiting by her side when no one else came. He spoke of Elena's fight to live and Sophie's unwavering devotion. His voice was low, but each word carried weight. Family, he said, isn't written on paper. It isn't blood alone. Family is who shows up, who stays, who protects when it would be easier to walk away. The judge leaned forward. "And you, Mr. Cole, you're prepared for what this means. It is not temporary charity, it is responsibility." Nathan nodded once. "I know, and I'm ready." The silence stretched until the judge turned to Sophie, who had been permitted to speak. She stood small but steady, her hand clasping the edge of her chair. "He didn't leave," she said softly. "That's why I want to stay with him. It was enough." The gavel came down with the ruling temporary custody awarded to Nathan with Elena's consent, supervised visits for David. The courtroom murmured, but Nathan only felt Sophie's hand slip into his, her fingers curling in quiet relief. When they returned to the hospital that evening, Elena was awake. She reached for Sophie first, then looked at Nathan with eyes that carried both gratitude and surrender. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't thank me. Just keep fighting. She still needs you." Weeks passed. Snow melted into slush, then gave way to the early hints of spring. Elena's strength grew slowly but surely. Sophie thrived with a new steadiness, her drawings evolving from houses with empty windows to families standing outside them. Nathan's office, once sterile and silent, now carried signs of her presence, sketches taped to his desk, a small backpack propped in the corner, a forgotten scarf on the chair. One morning, Sophie ran to him with a new drawing. 3 figures stood under a sky filled with stars, one small one, frail, one strong. Their hands were joined, and beneath them she had written, "Home." Nathan studied the page, his throat tightening. "It's us," she said with quiet pride. He nodded, pressing his hand gently over hers. When the final paperwork arrived, making his guardianship official, Nathan signed without hesitation. The merger, once his greatest pursuit, had closed without him. The company had survived, but for the first time he didn't measure his worth by its numbers. He measured it instead by the laughter echoing in the hospital corridors, by the resilience in Elena's recovering smile, by the trust in Sophie's eyes. On a crisp morning, months after that first night, Nathan walked out of the hospital hand in hand with Sophie. Elena followed slowly, wrapped in a coat against the chill. Snowflakes drifted from a stubborn sky, as if reminding them of where this had all begun. Sophie tilted her face upward and smiled. "Now I have 2 homes," she said. "One with Mommy and one with you." Nathan tightened his hold, a warmth rising that no storm could dim. He had walked into the snow that night a man alone, searching for nothing. He walked out now with something far greater than he had ever imagined. Not wealth, not power, but belonging chosen and kept. Sometimes he realized the choices that cost the most are the ones that give everything back. And sometimes the family we build is the one that saves us. Nathan Cole had built his life on control. Every decision calculated, every risk measured, every success carefully claimed. Yet the night he found Sophie collapsed in the snow, his world shifted from numbers and contracts to something immeasurable. What began as an impulsive act of compassion unraveled years of distance he had built between himself and human connection. He carried her into safety, and in doing so, carried himself out of the cold isolation he had mistaken for security. Sophie, a child burdened with more responsibility than her small shoulders should bear, taught Nathan what resilience looked like. She thought first of her mother Elena, even as her own body failed from hunger and cold. Her devotion became a mirror that forced Nathan to confront the emptiness of his own life. He had built skyscrapers but not a home, commanded boardrooms but never earned the trust of family. In Sophie's quiet bravery, he found the one thing that wealth could never buy: belonging. Elena's fragile fight for life deepened this transformation. For Nathan, supporting her was not charity, it was an acknowledgement of the promise he had made not only to Sophie, but also to himself. He would no longer be the man who turned away from pain. He became the one who stayed, who showed up, who chose people over profits. The courtroom battle against David Ruiz, the absent father, crystallized this choice. Nathan's voice carried not legal jargon, but truth. Family is not a claim of blood, it is the act of staying. Sophie's response: "He didn't leave," sealed the verdict more powerfully than any lawyer's argument. In the days that followed, a new rhythm of life took hold. Nathan no longer measured his worth in mergers or market shares, but in evenings spent at Sophie's side, in Elena's slow but steady recovery, in the laughter that began to echo in places once silent. The Lantern Project. His foundation for families facing illness grew out of this shift, a living symbol that even the smallest kindness could light the darkest nights. The story of Nathan, Sophie, and Elena is more than a tale of rescue. It is a story of transformation, of how one act of stepping forward can ripple into choices that redefine an entire life. It asks us a question we all must face. When the moment comes, will we choose to look away, or will we step forward? The lesson here is simple yet profound. Life will always present us with crossroads where comfort and compassion collide. We may be tempted to retreat into our routines, our walls, our excuses. But true change happens when we allow ourselves to be interrupted, when we stop at the bus stop, when we listen to the trembling voice, when we risk our own stability to give someone else a chance. Nathan's journey reminds us that family is not only where we are born, but where we are chosen, built, and protected. So, as you carry this story into your own life, ask yourself, where can you be the one who stays? Where can you choose presence over absence, love over convenience, action over silence? The answer may not change the whole world, but it could change one world, and that might be enough. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what it made you feel. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing you stories that remind us all of the power of kindness, resilience, and the families we choose. Your support gives us the strength to create the next story that may change someone's day or even their life.
If you want this type of stories, then subscribe to Golden Chapter Whispers.